Our story begins in the midst of the greatest economic wreck humanity had ever seen, in the dusty and dark world of the 1930s. Imagine a time when banks were closing one by one, factories had turned into massive graveyards, and millions of dignified people waited in long lines for a single loaf of bread. Until then, the world's economic guide had been Adam Smith's invisible hand theory. Classical economists whispered, "Stay calm, markets will heal themselves. Supply and demand will eventually meet. Prices will fall enough, and people will start buying again. Recovery is automatic." But the elegant equations of theory did not feed a hungry family. In the real world, demand did not return. Prices fell, yet unemployment was so deep that no one could afford anything, even at low prices. People hoarded their remaining pennies out of fear of losing them. The economy did not improve. It was frozen at absolute zero. It was at this frozen scene that Keynes made a diagnosis that would go down in history. Markets cannot always heal themselves. Sometimes the economy gets stuck in a dark feedback loop fueled by fear. People do not spend because they are afraid. Businesses fail because people do not spend. Unemployment rises because businesses fail. And the economy spirals into a black hole. Keynes understood that the system's flaw was not a lack of discipline or frugality. Its flaw was aggregate demand. In other words, the lifeblood of the economy, money in circulation, had stopped flowing. Here, he introduced the famous paradox of thrift. What is wise for an individual can be disastrous for society. If everyone tries to save at the same time during a recession, total spending collapses. And paradoxically, everyone becomes poorer, because one person's spending is always someone else's income. When you cut your spending, you cut your neighbor's income too. Thus, Keynes proposed a solution considered blasphemous by economists of the time. If the private sector is paralyzed by fear, the state must rise like a giant and spend. Governments should borrow, employ workers, build massive dams, roads, and bridges, and forcibly inject money into circulation. That money would enter a worker's pocket as wages. The worker would buy bread from a baker. The baker would order flour, and the frozen economic machine would start to heat up again. For the old school, this was madness. Keynes shattered the rigid rule that governments should not interfere with markets. He did not claim that debt itself was good. He believed in the sanctity of timing. Governments must act counter-cyclically. Pour water on the fire when the blaze is raging, spend, and save it when the skies are clear, refrain from spending. Keynes's 1936 masterpiece, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, was not just dry numbers. He viewed the economy as a psychological battlefield. What drives markets, he argued, are not complex algorithms, but animal spirits. People invest when hopeful and retreat when afraid. You cannot fix these instincts merely by changing interest rates. Only visible, bold, collective action, essentially, the state saying, "I am here and I will keep this machine running," can restore them. In Keynesian logic, government spending does more than purchase goods. It sells a message of confidence. And that confidence becomes economic energy in itself. This is why Keynes knew that recessions were ended, not by mathematical formulas, but by renewing societal belief. Yet the world did not easily accept this new idea. In the early 1930s, world leaders still worshiped the doctrine of austerity. Britain suffocated its own industry by returning to the gold standard. In Germany, the Brüning government cut spending and tried to impose discipline, pushing millions of unemployed into the arms of extremism, Nazism. In the U.S., Herbert Hoover waited, believing the market would heal itself. But by 1933, 1 in 4 Americans was unemployed. Then came Franklin D. Roosevelt and his philosophy of the New Deal. Roosevelt was not born a Keynesian, but instinctively reached the same point. Massive projects like the Tennessee Valley Authority opened the doors of employment for millions. But it was the greatest tragedy in history, World War II, that would prove Keynes's theories beyond debate. When war broke out, no government said, "Our budget cannot handle this." They spent without hesitation. Factories reopened to produce tanks and planes. Unemployment vanished overnight. The irony was stark. The greatest modern economic experiment succeeded during a war of destruction. As the state spent, production increased. As production increased, incomes rose. By the end of the war, the world was no longer the same. Keynesian economics had arrived. From 1945 to the early 1970s, the world experienced the golden age of capitalism. Keynes's influence was everywhere, in the Marshall Plan rebuilding Europe, in the Bretton Woods system regulating global finance, and in the rise of the welfare state. Capitalism was no longer a wild jungle. It had become a garden, pruned, watered, and managed by the state. During this period, recessions were no longer as frightening. Governments functioned like thermostats, spending more when the economy cooled and cutting back when it heated. Yet the great success carried a hidden cost. Keynes designed a tool for crisis management, but politicians, tasting its power, turned it into a way of life. Voters liked stimulus but hated austerity. Keynes's advice to save in good times quietly disappeared in the corridors of political populism. By the 1970s, the Keynesian machine began to creak. When oil shocks hit, the impossible happened. Both unemployment and inflation rose simultaneously, a phenomenon called stagflation. Keynesian formulas were powerless. The system was flush with money, but production had stalled. In this vacuum, Milton Friedman and the monetarists emerged. They defined the state as a problem, not a solution. Free the market, tighten the money supply, they said. For a while, Keynes seemed dead, his theories shelved in the dusty archives of history. The world turned toward a neoliberal path under Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. But Keynes had not died. He was merely hibernating, waiting for the next great crisis. That crisis came in 2008, when the greed of the financial world exploded. Free market advocates lined up at the government's door, crying, "Save us!" Governments reopened Keynes's dusty playbook, this time with trillions of dollars in quantitative easing. But this time something was different. In Keynes's original plan, money went to the real economy, to workers and bridges. In 21st century Keynesianism, money flowed to financial markets. Asset prices, stocks and real estate soared, while the average worker's wage stagnated. This created the largest inequality gap in history. Keynes's engine no longer powered society broadly. It only charged the luxury cars of the upper class. The pandemic then brought this to its peak. Governments printed unprecedented amounts of money and deposited it directly into citizens' accounts. For a moment, it seemed magical. Life was frozen, yet the economy alive. But the bill was never delayed. A global wave of inflation swept the world. Today, we live in a strange love-hate relationship with John Maynard Keynes's legacy. In every crisis, we cling to him. In every recovery, we sink deeper under the debt we owe him. Governments are no longer spenders of last resort, but the economy's only spender. The state is no longer the thermostat, it is the fuel itself. Keynes once famously told his critics, "In the long run, we are all dead." This was a call to action, urging governments not to postpone what must be done. Yet over time it became a pretext for mortgaging the future to short-term political gains. And here lies the tragic irony of Keynes. He was an aristocrat, trying to save capitalism from destruction, and he succeeded repeatedly reviving it from the brink. But in saving it, he chained the system to perpetual debt, permanent state support, and fragility. The genius who taught governments how to spend generously never fully imparted the vital lesson of restraint. Today, in every penny spent, every stimulus received, and every inflation payment made, his shadow lingers. Keynes showed us the way out of despair, but perhaps intentionally left unsaid what cliff awaited at the end of that path. The world is shaped not by those who speak the most, but by those who plan the best. Keep the spectacle for others. Reserve real power for yourself. Old money. The great wealth hidden in silence.